This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
And on today's show, we talk to publisher, poet and novelist Neil Astley. Neil talks about the latest Blood Axe anthology, Soul Feast, a companion anthology to 2007's Soul Food. And like Soul Food, Soul Feast is a serving of poems to stir the mind and feed the spirit, and to bring hope and light in uncertain times. We'll also be talking to Neil about how he came to publishing and what sustains him, and indeed Blood Axe, in this trade for, I suppose you could say, optimists and obsessives.
But first up, we thought it would be nice to have a taster of two of the Irish poets included in this wonderful anthology. So we're going to have Enda Coyle Green reading her poem, followed by Mary O'Donnell and her poem.
Hope is a thing with feathers, according to Emily Dickinson. A feeling at times so fleeting that it can be all too easy to ignore. It's also the motto of one barrel of my two names, and the discovery of that, quite by accident, was the spark that started this poem. Hope. She has a sense of somewhere beyond here where there is hope. A note cools on a piano in a room long emptied, and so well that only the ghosts notice. She's aware of them all. They catch her breathing now and then, attempting to turn around again in a space that grows narrow but not bitter with age. The night's end stage, perhaps. Its black edge stopped dead by a sliver of morning light. The certainty of sorts of a day where something, anything, might happen. Oscillating, she assumes the shape, skin slipping to a place where she can wait.
During the COVID years, there was an ad on television which was for a chewing gum, and it showed all the young people suddenly being free to pour out of their apartment buildings and their houses and all that kind of thing. And I began to think how marvellous it would be when we were finally released from the fairly high level of containment that had prevailed in Ireland. So I was thinking then, I don't know how it moved to butterflies, but it did. And the future seemed a wonderfully intimate prospect. And this is the resulting poem, which is really using butterflies as a metaphor. The intimate future. The first day will startle in a paradise of spectacle and movement. In this release from the wintry cocoon, the long chill over, we will forget our solitude. Like nectar-starved butterflies, we'll cluster together in displays of brightening wings, velvety trims, our chitined scales and spots trembling at the end of long starvation. We'll fly close, so close to one another in drifts of prismatic colour, our patterns, shapes, antennae colliding, shifting, crowding sociably to drink and drink. Such intimate nectars, proboscis fed to another's need, wings sugar drowsy.
I was working on a newspaper in Darwin. I was a journalist before I started publishing. I'd also worked in a publishing job in London before that. And Christmas Day 1974, Cyclone Tracy completely destroyed the city of Darwin in the Northern Territory. And I was actually in my brother's house at the time. The house collapsed on top of us. We were in the bathroom and we'd managed to wedge a mattress underneath, knowing that the house would likely go, even though it was a good part of it was brick. So we used the mattress as a kind of tent to lie under. And so the rafters of the house came down over us, and we were under there for 6 hours. with no idea what's going on outside because it was totally black. The radio had gone, the lights had gone, everything had gone. And we just stuck it out for that time until eventually the noise calmed down and we realised that we'd survived. And I wrote a poem about that, 2 poems about that in the first book, Darwin Survivor, about being given a second life and how everything after was a gift in a way. So that sense, I think, goes through a lot of the poems that I've chosen over the years. And then I decided to come back to England. I lost everything I had there, and I'd always had this idea I might want to get a job in publishing in London. And so I decided to go to university as a mature student and studied in Newcastle. But at the end of that period, because I was so connected with everything going on in poetry in Newcastle, I was editing Stand magazine with John Silkin for 3 years. I was the production editor of the magazine because I had that kind of experience. I was involved in Morden Tower readings, small presses, that kind of thing. And I just decided I didn't want to go to London to get a job in publishing. I wanted to actually try and set up something from scratch in Newcastle, which is how Blood Axe started when I finished university in 1978.
Neil Astley is editor of Blood Axe Books, which he founded in 1978. His books include novels, poetry collections, anthologies, notably those in Blood Axe's Staying Alive anthology series, Staying Alive 2002, Being Alive 2004, Being Human in 2011, Staying Human 2020, which is a Poetry Book Society's special commendation. Soul Food, Nourishing Poems for Starved Minds, with Pamela Robertson Pierce, came out in 2007, and a companion volume, Soul Feast, Nourishing Poems of Hope and Light, also with Pamela Robertson Pierce, has just come out, and we'll be talking about that later.
And Neil has published 2 novels, The End of My Tether from Flambard in 2002, Scribner 2003, which was shortlisted for the Whitbread First Novel Award, and The Sheep Who Changed the World, I love that title, and 2 poetry collections, Darwin Survivor, Peterloo Poets 1988, a Poetry Book Society recommendation, and Biting My Tongue, which came out in 1995. In 2012, Candlestick Press published his selection of 10 poems about sheep in its renowned pamphlet series. He received an Eric Gregory Award for his poetry, was given a D.Litt from Newcastle University for his work with Blood Axe Books, and in 2018 was made an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Neil lives in Northumberland, and you are very welcome indeed to Books for Breakfast. It's lovely to have Neil Astley here sipping on coffee and having cake. Wonderful that you're here.
Neil, you're here to promote Soul Feast, which is, as we were saying, a companion anthology to Soul Food, and you describe it as a further feast of thoughtful poems to stir the mind and feed the spirit. And I was wondering if I could first turn to just anthologies in general, because I'm a bit of an anthology addict. I'm surrounded by them. I'm looking at whole shelves of them from where I'm sitting at the kitchen table here. And I begin pretty much every day by dipping into one. And of course, Blood Axe has been feeding my habit for years with what I think of as the Bee Gees anthologies, all that, Staying Alive, Being Human, and so on. And I was wondering, what is the power, the attraction of anthologies? Why are they so popular? What draws people to them? What draws you to them? What draws you to compile them? And what kind of response have you got to them?
Well, I mean, it all came about when I started thinking about poems which I regard as talismanic poems, kinds of poems that people put on their fridges, keep in their wallets, send to friends, share them. And in the days before the internet, that's how those poems tended to circulate. And also thinking about things like the Poems on the Underground series, where you sit on a tube train and you get to see and read one poem a few times. And those strong individual poems that speak to everyone. I had the idea with Staying Alive, the first one, of actually gathering all those together that I knew and trying to build an anthology around those thematically. And as that series evolved, other people would send me poems that they loved and that they thought, other readers would really love. And so that series became a series in which it wasn't just my choices of poems, but readers' choices. And those anthologies really took off by word of mouth, in that people would buy one or be given one, and then they'd go off and get another half a dozen because they were they connected with the book so much that they wanted to give copies to friends. And then the same thing happened with Soul Food in 2007. With Soul Food, it's a smaller book. It's one you can put in your pocket, keep by your bedside. The Staying Alive series of anthologies are modern poems, and Soul Food takes poems from all times, as does the new one, Soul Feast. So those two strands really run through both those, the Staying Alive series and Soul Food and Soul Feast. And it's about really trying to connect really strong individual poems that speak to everything that's going on in people's lives, trying to connect with a much wider readership. People often turn to poetry at times of extreme emotion, grief or love, but there are also so many other areas of everyday life that people find poetry really, helps them or sustains them or inspires them. And so those anthologies really were trying to reach those kinds of readers, but also to try and showcase the work of all the amazing poets that I'm familiar with that a lot of people don't come across normally. And I think they've been a kind of bridge for a lot of people in their reading, in that they've gone off and they wanted to read more poems by the individual poets who are featured in the books.
The two of them are here on the table, and they piece together and form a complete painting as well, which is really wonderful when you put them side by side. But Soul Food was described as nourishing poems for starved minds, Soul Feast as nourishing poems of hope and light. And you've just said it there, this is what people turn to poetry, I think, for, don't they? For nourishment, for hope, for light. But I'm also thinking of the darker times. I personally have found that in dark times, like say my mother died 2 years ago, I could pull it down from the shelf and I could read at it. So do you think that maybe, in a way, there are moments of discomfort and unhappiness when people will turn to them?
That's right. So Soul Food, I think the selection was much more spiritual based, poems of thought, poems of the spirit. But in Soul Feast, we wanted to make a more worldly selection. So there are poems relating to tolerance and hope, which, is an area that we felt actually fell within that kind of anthology, but it's not necessarily one that you would expect. So we wanted to broaden the kind of remit for that particular type of anthology to bring in those more worldly poems.
That's exactly what my next question was, because one of the kind of sort of paradoxically interesting things about, for me, was that, you're used to seeing maybe the big kind of spiritual sort of names that you might expect, and they're not here, like the St. John of the Cross or Rumi or Hopkins or, I don't know, Mary Oliver. So it's clear that you're trying to shift the template a bit in this one.
And to include more poems that people might not have come across, more poets. So although there is an overlap, and there's also an overlap with the Staying Alive series. There are poems in this book which are in some of the Staying Alive volumes, but it has a different readership. And so we felt it was worth actually giving those poems a second showing, and particularly a poem like Edip Cansever, the Turkish poet, which is a talismanic poem for Turkish readers, Table, which is an astonishing poem. Often when I go and do events somewhere, I will always start off by reading that poem without introduction. And then people go, wow, at the end. And then I tell them it was written, in the 1950s by a Turkish poet. And they're completely wowed because they think it's something very modern and very unusual. And they can't understand how something which is from the 1950s can speak to them now.
We knew Richard Tillinghast, who translated, and in fact, I know you use that in pretty much every.
Oh, I often use it in writing classes and poetry classes, and you can change it to a million things. I'll put on the plate or I'll put in the bag, but it's a beautiful poem. The way it starts off with basic objects, and then it turns into, of course, the journey of life.
Well, he came across the poem when he was doing a Turkish conversation class in Istanbul, and the teacher brought it in. And he decided to translate it. And then it was published in Atlantic Monthly, I think. And then it was published in an anthology from Ireland. And then suddenly we've given it an amazing new life by including it in Being Human. And then it really taking off and getting really well known everywhere.
And it's wonderful to encounter something like that. I remember the joy of finding that poem and going, oh, yes. And of course, you think it's just for you, but everybody else is enjoying it too. But there are 5 sections to Soul Feast. It's a 5-part spiritual meal. That's what I felt anyway. I was being nourished. The first part is about journeys. The journeys are all about traveling light. The focus is on the essentials without any material trappings to weigh the spirit down. Like the poem As I Go by Julius Chingono. My pot is an old paint container. I do not know who bought it. And again, I love the poem If China by the Polish poet Stanisław Baranczak, who Peter actually once met in Dublin a few years ago. Isn't that right, Peter?
Yeah, no, I met him actually with Seamus Heaney. He was working on the Laments of Jan Kochanowski. They were an amazing book of kind of medieval Polish poet laments for his lost child. So yeah, I met him then.
But just to get back to the poem by Stanisław Baranczak, I like the way it's about focusing on the essential. If you're going to have China, just have old stuff that you wouldn't miss. And it's a poem which brilliantly ends. Who told you could settle in? Who told you this or that would last forever? Didn't anyone tell you you'll never in the world feel at home here? Or again, the notion of a journey of life in a poem like William Stafford's The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. And, you know, we were talking about Edith Cancelver's The Table, but another poem that I love is Ruth Stone's Train Ride, which begins, all things come to an end, and then it ends, no, they go on forever. So these are all great poets, and many of you out there will be familiar with it. But one of the great things about anthologies is encountering, as you said, poets you haven't heard of before. For me, it was Baranczak or Brigo Ibaragi or Tune Tellegen or Liesl Müller. And how did you find these poets, Neil?
Well, a lot of reading over many, many years. And then when I do the anthologies, or we do them in this case, me and Pamela, I'm also looking for poems that speak to one another, poems that connect with each other. And very often a particular poem might come to mind, and then I look it up, and then suddenly I think of another poem, and I rush to the shelves and find that other poem. I think, yes, put the two in together. And then sometimes a third one comes along. And in the case of this anthology, because it was focused also on hope, I tried to think of all the poems that either of us knew about hope. And we ended up cheating by including a poem by Edith Södergran, which had been in Salford. That's the only overlap. Just because it seemed a perfect fit for those poems about hope.
Yeah, I don't think that's cheating. I think that's a gift, Neil. Thank you very much for including that. I love her as a poet too. Yeah, it's just so celebratory reading this book. I really loved it.
One of the sections is titled Soul's Search, which is, I suppose, very explicitly addresses the theme. So there are prayers, religion, the search for answers, and sometimes making up our own religion, such as in The Believer by Kathleen Osip. I made a God, I called her grace, I said my prayers, I call them pleasure. Pleasure her way to teach me pleasure, pleasure a stream, and I a fish. I kind of love that idea of pleasure. And again, she's not a poet I was familiar with. How did you find her?
Roddy Lumsden actually championed her, and he sent me her first book, and then I was in touch with her, and she sent me her second book, and that one poem I just felt was absolutely perfect for the book. But a number of those poems are also about making do with what's in life. There's also an Arun Kolatkar poem called Yeshwant Rao, which is about a kind of making your own god, a rubbish god, and you can make any kind of god you want that serves you. And then there's Dennis O'Driscoll's poem about, how God is still in the world. And, there's another poem in the previous anthology, Missing God. And so there's all those ways of looking at God that people who are not necessarily believers can connect with in terms of their own spiritual concerns. They might pivot on God or an absence of God, but they still speak to everyone, I think.
The Soul Search section, it's also about body search, mind search, reconciling our physical life on the real and tangible earth with imaginings of what if anything might come afterwards. And I was thinking of a poem like Mae Swenson's Question. And Neil, you have it there, and it would be lovely to hear you read it.
Yes, it's a beautiful sounding poem. So this is Question. Body my house, my horse my hound, what will I do when you are fallen? Where will I sleep? How will I ride? What will I hunt? Where can I go without my mount, all eager and quick? How will I know in thicket ahead is danger or treasure, when body my good, bright dog is dead? How will it be to lie in the sky, without roof or door, and wind for an eye? With cloud for shift, how will I hide?
Yeah, it's a wonderful poem. And the Soul Search section is very connected with the following section, Life on Earth. And you can't really separate the two. There's a nice counterbalance to the spiritual earthly pleasures, like in Linda Pastan's Imaginary Conversation, a poem that I really like. And if you two don't mind, I'm going to read it now. So it's called Imaginary Conversation, Linda Pastan. You tell me to live each day as if it were my last, This is in the kitchen, where before coffee I complain of the day ahead, that obstacle race of minutes and hours, grocery stores and doctors. But why the last, I ask? Why not live each day as if it were the first, all raw astonishment, Eve rubbing her eyes awake that first morning, the sun coming up like an ingenue in the east? You grind the coffee with the small roar of a mind trying to clear itself. I set the table, glance at the window, where dew has baptized every living surface.
Great. And not to be left out, I love the short poem by Gregory. Gregory Orr is a poet I've always liked a lot. His prose and his poetry. And I know there's a little tiny film somewhere on the internet out there where he reads this poem as well. And I really like it. To be alive is the title. To be alive, not just the carcass, but the spark. That's crudely put, but if we're not supposed to dance, why all this music?
Can I just add here, one of the other things we do with the anthology is helpful biographical notes at the back of the book. And you've just read that Gregory Orr poem, and I'd like to just read what we wrote about Gregory Orr. Gregory Orr, born 1947, grew up in the rural Hudson Valley north of New York. At the age of 12, he shot and killed his brother in a hunting accident, an event that powerfully influenced his ideas about trauma, silence, and poetry. After his mother's sudden death in Haiti, he worked as a civil rights volunteer and was kidnapped at gunpoint in rural Alabama and held for a week in solitary confinement. These events of his youth form the basis of his memoir, The Blessing, 2002, which tells the story of his childhood and how he came to poetry. And I like to think that when you go to the back and find out about the poet, you go back to the poem. And although you're not meant to bring biographical elements to a reading of the poem, I think in that particular poem, to know where that poem has come from in terms of the life of that particular man is very good, very helpful to a reader to know that.
Yeah, I agree, because what an incredible biographical note. Also, another poet that I discovered because of Blood Axe, and I want to thank you for that, is Rosemary Tonks. And I know that you had a special kind of relationship with her. There's a poem in it called Addiction to an Old Mattress. It's an amazing poem, isn't it?
It was a one-sided relationship I had with her. I could say something about that when you read it, if you like.
Well, I mean, I was just actually, okay, would you like me to read the poem? Okay, I'll read, I'll start it. Addiction to an Old Mattress, Rosemary Tonks. No, this is not my life, thank God. Worn out like this and crippled by brain fag. Obsessed first by one person and then, almost at once, most horribly besotted by another. These Februaries full of drafts and cracks, they belong to the people on the streets, the others out there, haberdashers, writers of menus. Salt breezes, boasters from Istanbul, barometers full of contempt, controlling, moody isobars, sumptuous tittle-tattle from a summer crowd that's fed on lemonades and matinees, and seas that float themselves about from place to place, and then spend hours just moving some clear sleets across glass stones, Yalta, deck chairs in Asia's gold cake thrones. Meanwhile, I live on, powerful, disobedient, inside their drafty haberdasher's climate with these people who are going to obsess me. Potatoes, dentists, people I hardly know. It's unforgivable, for this is not my life, but theirs that I am living, and I wolf, bolt, gulp it down day after day. What an amazing last verse, isn't it, as well? I mean, the poem just builds and builds, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's another Carpe Diem poem, isn't it? But a sort of jaded Carpe Diem, but it's still Carpe Diem, like a lot of those others that are in the book and the other book too.
And would you say a little bit about your relationship with Rosemary Tonks?
Well, I mean, she disappeared in the late 60s after publishing 2 books of poetry. No one knew where she was. I'd been wanting to republish her poems because I thought they were wonderful, those 2 books. And because I'd said something about this in print somewhere, it came to the attention of one of her family members, a cousin, who contacted me and said they were very worried about her. They didn't want to interfere with anything, But if I wanted to contact her and let her know that I would like to republish her work, and so I did write to her, didn't get any response. I asked whether I might go and visit her, and they said yes, but, do it respectfully. So we went down to Bournemouth, where she was living, where no one else knew where she was. Went to the door, she didn't answer. We knew she was in. And then I spoke to a neighbour who I then put in touch with the family, so that then the family could talk to the neighbour, who would tell them, oh yes, I saw her going out today to the shops and that. So they knew that she was okay. And then there was a radio programme that Brian Pratton presented on the BBC about Rosemary Tonks, with various people with various theories about what had happened to her. I was the only person that knew, and I didn't let on at all, because this was the agreement I had with the family. But I sent her a postcard letting her know that all these modern writers now were really interested in her work, and she was much admired. And after her death, when her family let me look at her diaries, I discovered that she had actually noted the correspondence she'd had from me. And in relation to that broadcast, she said, second postcard from Satan. Was because by that stage, she had entered an area of sort of fundamentalist Christianity. She'd got to the place where she was through a mental breakdown. She'd almost gone blind. She'd completely disowned her work. She'd burned a novel that she'd written. And she completely regarded everything in her former life as anathema. But her family very much wanted her work to come to light again. So fortunately, after her death, I was able to republish her work in Bedouin of the London Evening. But we had this one-sided correspondence. I wrote to her and I sent her books, which I'm sure she burned. I sent her Blood Axe anthologies of women poets and Staying Alive and that kind of thing. I'm sure they ended up in the incinerator. But yes, and then I was able to write the obituary on her, which appeared in The Guardian a couple of weeks after her death. And that was the first that anyone knew about what had happened to her.
Well done for saving her and bringing her. And it's wonderful to see her in this anthology. It's a great story, Neil. Thank you for sharing that with us. Also, Joan Marguerite's "Love is a Place," another poet that I've discovered. Love is a place. It endures beyond everything. From there we come, and it's the place where life remains. Or William Stafford, my father heard so much that we still stand inviting the quiet by turning the face, waiting for a time when something in the night will touch us too from the other place. They're just beautiful poems, aren't they, Neil?
They're all great, kind of memorable poems, but it's the kind of book that you want to keep on, I suppose, quoting from, and I suppose that you got to keep on dipping into, because I think that's what you do, I suppose, with anthologies. You don't read them, you don't sit down and read them from cover to cover. You kind of dip in. And one thing it seems to me that anthologies like this definitely do is to focus attention on individual poems, not so much poets or books. And I wonder, Neil, if you'd agree that the essential unit of poetry is actually the poem.
Yeah. And sometimes poets themselves don't realize this. Sometimes they get a permission request. I want to include such and such a poem in an anthology. And they say, I don't want to be represented with that poem. Please, can you choose? And then they give me a list of other poems that don't relate to the anthology at all. So you have to go for the poem that you want for that anthology, because you know why you want that poem.
Yeah, I like that. You have to be driven, don't you? Because you're the editor after all, but poets always think they know better. You're in dangerous ground here, with two poets at the kitchen table. But you're in Ireland, and you're sitting at a breakfast table here in Dublin, and Irish poets also feature in the anthology. Poets like Kerry Hardy, Mary O'Donnell, Enda Coyle-Green, Jane Clark, not to mention the man on the other side of the breakfast table, Mr. Sirr. But I know that one Irish poet in particular has been a great friend to you, and he meant an awful lot to you. And that man was Brendan Kennelly, a man of huge heart, intelligence and talent. Obviously a great poet too. He was, in fact, the very first poet that I met when I was a young student in secondary school. He came to our school, and I remember the nuns had him up on a big stage, and he was looking down at all these convent girls. But one of the things he said to us was, by the time you've reached the age of 12, you'll have enough experiences in your life that will last for the whole of your writing life. Which I think is an interesting thing to say, because we were very close to that age. And I thought, because when you're young, you think your experiences aren't valid. But he was saying, no, they are. And don't ever think that they're not. And you can write about them. So we kept in touch. And I know he was very encouraging to many other Irish poets, including Paula Meehan, Katie Donovan, whose new book, May Swim, is here on the table beside us too. It's soon due from Blood Axe as well. So I suppose what I'd like to know is what drew you to Brendan Kennelly, the man and the poet?
Yes, it was Cromwell. Cromwell had been published in Ireland. It wasn't available in Britain. And the editor of the Rialto, John Wakeman, featured some extracts from Cromwell in the Rialto. And with a little note saying British publishers should leap on this and publish it over here. So that's what happened. I came to Ireland for the first time, in fact, in December 1985, where I met Brendan in O'Neill's. He'd just come off the drink, so he was on the Ballygowan. And we got on fine. The publisher, the Irish publisher, Beaver Row, was gradually grinding to a halt. And so not only did we publish Cromwell in Britain, but we then took over the Irish distribution. And after that, we then published all his substantial poetry books following that. Because, his publication record before that had been quite sporadic. He didn't have one editor that worked with him over a period of time. And we established a very strong working relationship. He produced these huge books, which I was very happy to produce, but he wanted me to whittle them down, which I did. So a book like the Book of Judas was probably twice as big as the published version in the end. So you think of Book of Judas as being a massive tome. Well, it was a huge manuscript. And, we worked very well together over the years. And so I saw him a lot when I came to Ireland. I've just walked to you today from Trinity, and we used to go on walks around Dublin. He was always walking around Dublin and meeting people everywhere, talking to everyone. Everyone knew him. So I was very privileged to have that experience of walking by his side and hearing his wisdom, hearing everything he had to say about everything going on around him, or everything he would say to people that he came across. It was a real joy to spend that time with him. And then we were also working on an anthology, The Heavy Bear Who Goes With Me, which was 100 poems by poets through the ages, with me and Brendan in conversation about those poems, which faltered when he became ill. And eventually I managed to piece it together and put it together as a kind of tribute to him shortly after his death. But I think I published about 20 books by him over the years, including some plays. And it was a marvelous experience to spend all that time and to work with him. Yeah. A real gift.
Yeah, it was a real gift. Because I was saying to you earlier, we live near the canal, and he often did a big loop from Trinity all up around. And I met him one New Year's morning. He was the first person I met, and I thought, now that is a blessing, blessed by the poet Kennelly.
I saw him with Patrick Kavanagh on that bench on the canal.
Really? Oh, wow. That's brilliant. Okay, so listen, we would love if you read. There's a very short poem by Brendan in the anthology. It's beautiful, and we'd love to hear it.
Permission. We lie here and know that peace is a raindrop on a blade of grass, a globe of light inches from our eyes. So our world retains its style of survival, depending all the while on what permits it to be complete and fragile.
Beautiful. Neil, I did want to ask you, Peter and I are here at the breakfast table, and we run the podcast together, and we do various things together in life and in poetry. But you've been in partnership with Pamela Robertson-Pearce, your partner in life. And what was that like, making an anthology together like that?
Pamela is a filmmaker, and we'd already done filmmaking together, me acting as a kind of producer. But over the years, she's helped show me how to film poets. So when I've been in places where she's not been, I've been able to film the poets. But we've also done joint projects on filming of poets. And then with these anthologies, Soul Food and Soul Feast, she had the idea of soul food. And she's Swedish, but she spent 20 years in America. And she knew a lot of American poets that I hadn't come across before. And we had the idea then that we would bring together our reading into soul food and see how we could make the two mesh together in a book which had those kinds of themes. I mean, particularly, she was a great reader of Rumi, of Rilke, Mary Oliver, and so on. And those really came together in soul food. Yeah. And then years later, we decided it was time to do another one. We've been talking about it for a few years. And Soul Feast was the result of that. Another collaboration, a very happy collaboration. I don't think there were any arguments. We only had 100 poems, so the main thing was actually whittling down the selection to poems that we were both happy with, and we were both happy with the final selection.
It's great. It's a very fruitful collaboration.
Yes,
so
like yours.
Thank you. You've spoken earlier about how you came to Newcastle and then you set up Blood Axe. I've often thought that I would hate to be a publisher. I just thought it must be it's a bit crazy, isn't it? It's kind of half saint, half mad, obsessive. Is it difficult and challenging? Has that been your experience? I'm sure it's been utterly inspiring as well.
No, you're loved by everyone that publishes you and not liked at all by people that you're not able to publish. Not because you don't want to publish them or because you don't think their work is good, but you only have the capacity to do, in our case, 24 new titles a year. We can't do more than that. And our stable of over 100, 200 poets, they're producing books all the time. And it's just not possible to publish everyone else, unfortunately.
And what keeps you going then? What is it the work? It is poems, isn't it?
Yeah, the work and the amazing new collections that are coming in all the time, discoveries, and also wanting to make work available in translation, which has always been a very important part of what Blood Axe does, making American poets available here, opening up the availability of all kinds of different poets to readers and to other poets, I think has been really an important part of Blood Axe over the years.
Are there new titles that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, we're always looking forward to new titles. Sarah Holland Batt, for example, Australian writer, that we're doing a retrospective of hers called The Jaguar, which is the title of her third collection, and it's a compilation from 3 collections by her. And she's going to be doing a tour in Britain in September, but she's actually also doing an event at Cork Poetry Festival in May. She's an amazing discovery. Although I say that, I've followed her work right from her first collection, and I helped put on a reading by her in Ledbury many, many years ago, and I've just loved her work ever since. But it's always difficult to take on a poet who is not known at all to readers here. So you have to really do what you can to put the word out, to try and interest people in someone they haven't come across before and try and share those delights with the readers.
It's been so interesting speaking to you, Neil. I was going to say, if there was a poem that you would like to read from Soul Feast that you really, really like, we could finish on that. And we'd like to thank Neil Astley for joining us at the breakfast table. Soul Feast, Nourishing Poems of Hope and Light is now available, and details will be on our website, booksforbreakfast.budsprout.com. And Neil is now flicking through to finish us off with a beautiful poem.
Right, I think I'd like to read Table, in fact.
Good choice.
Yeah, I'd like to read the poem Table by the Turkish poet Edip Cansever, who's actually spelled Cansever, but it's pronounced Cansever, I think. Translated from the Turkish by Julia Claire Tillinghast and Richard Tillinghast. A man filled with the gladness of living put his keys on the table, put flowers in a copper bowl there. He put his eggs and milk on the table. He put there the light that came in through the window, sound of a bicycle, sound of a spinning wheel, the softness of bread and weather he put there. On the table the man put things that happened in his mind, what he wanted to do in life, he put that there. Those he loved, those he didn't love, the man put them on the table too. 3 times 3 makes 9. The man put 9 on the table. He was next to the window, next to the sky. He reached out and placed on the table endlessness. So many days he'd wanted to drink a beer. He put on the table the pouring of that beer. He placed there his sleep and his wakefulness, his hunger and his fullness he put there. Now that's what I call a table. It didn't complain at all about the load. It wobbled once or twice, then stood firm. The man kept piling things on.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.budsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.